Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Abigail Rawleigh, and welcome to the Poetry of Emily Dickinson. I'm really excited to be teaching this course for the Interim Literature Project, and I'm excited to learn alongside you either on YouTube or during our weekly meetings if you're in the Zoom class. So, over the next 8 weeks, we'll be learning more about the life and work of Emily Dickinson. Because Dickinson wrote nearly 2,000 poems, we'll only just scratch the surface of her body of work. And so I hope that the skills of close reading and literary analysis that we'll learn together in this course will help you continue to engage Dickinson and other poetry, for that matter, long after our final meeting or the final YouTube video. This course traces a handful of themes in Dickinson's poetry: nature, religion, death, science, print, and the home or the domestic space. But that's not to say that these are the only themes in Dickinson's work or that any of these are mutually exclusive. Dickinson writes about much more than these 6 themes. We'll encounter poetry that reflects on gender, love, romance, madness, the self, time, eternity, and much, much more. So instead of closing off opportunities for discovery and interpretation, think of the 6 course themes as ways to focus our reading and umbrellas under which we can have a variety of conversations about the many other themes in Dickinson's poetry. So we'll begin each course with a very short introduction to some of the day's themes and guiding questions. Today, I'll give you a brief overview of who Dickinson was, though we'll continue to develop our understanding of the historical context in which she lived throughout our time together in this course. And I'll end with some tips for close reading. Now, you've heard that term twice. That's what literary critics call the process of slowly and carefully reading and then analyzing and interpreting a literary text. In our case, the poetry of Emily Dickinson. So let me share my PowerPoint. So today's guiding question: who was Emily Dickinson and how should we approach her poetry? Emily Dickinson was born in 1830 and died in 1886. So she died in her 50s and lived through a really important time period in the history of the United States. We don't have that many images of Dickinson herself. This is a daguerreotype from when she was young. And we also have this description that she writes in a letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who would become a friend and mentor throughout Dickinson's life. She describes herself this way: I am small like the wren, and my hair is bold like the chestnut burr, and my eyes like the sherry in the glass that the guest leaves. One thing that I love about this self-description is there's a lot of color there, but the sherry in the glass always stands out to me because sherry is a little bit reddish, and that's what she's using to describe her eyes. So I think, as we'll see in her poetry, Dickinson is always creating character and doing unexpected things with her imagery. This letter and other letters like it can be found online in the Dickinson Electronic Archive. You can follow the link on this PowerPoint, and we'll actually talk more about digital resources several weeks down the road. So Dickinson was born in Amherst, Massachusetts. She attended Amherst Academy, where she got really interested in science, especially botany, and then later attended Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, but she only spent 1 year there. She refused to publicly confess her Christian faith, which becomes sort of a sticking point for her poetry, as we'll learn in a couple of weeks when we talk about religion. And after her time at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, she returned to her family's home in Amherst called the Homestead, where she remained for the rest of her life. Here's a picture of the homestead. We often have this cultural conception of Dickinson as the isolated genius writing away in her bedroom. And while that is a lot of what she did day to day, often what she was writing were correspondences to friends, like the letter that we just saw a few slides before. She read and corresponded really widely. And while she didn't leave the homestead very often, she was deeply connected to the world around her. She also had a variety of domestic duties: entertaining callers, gardening, cooking and housework, maintaining familial relationships. In a letter, her sister Lavinia says that she did all the housework so Dickinson could write. So I guess it's kind of contested who actually did these sorts of things. But Dickinson spent her life with her family in the family home, as you can see in this picture, and especially in the garden that she so loved at the homestead. So some important features of Dickinson's poetry and things that if you're familiar with Dickinson, you might already have a sense of. Dickinson's poems are what are called lyric. So lyric poems in general tend to have a singular speaker, tend to be subjective, representing some sort of subjective experience, emotion maybe, and they're often short, though all of these definitions are things that literary critics like to challenge. But the most important feature of Dickinson's lyric poetry are her personae. So in Dickinson's poems, we encounter a lot of different voices, speakers who describe themselves in different ways. Dickinson says in the same letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson that we saw before, when I state myself as the representative of the verse, it does not mean me, but a supposed person. So while we read poetry written by Dickinson, we can't always interpret the speaker of the poem as a representation of Dickinson herself. We hear the voices of many different personae in these poems. Many of her poems were sewn together into fascicles, as you can see here. Others were written on envelopes and scraps of paper. And the breadth of Dickinson's poetic work really wasn't understood until after her death, when family and friends began going through her papers in her room and things like that and discovered all these fascicles. Dickinson shared poetry with friends, but not many poems were published in her lifetime, and none were published under her own name. So these poems, by and large, are really pretty short. And so because of that, there's really careful, intentional word choice. There's also a stylistic contrast with contemporary 19th century poets that we'll talk about more in the coming weeks. And one of those sort of key features of contrast is Dickinson's use of the dash, which if you know anything about Emily Dickinson, you probably already recognize the prevalence of the dash in her poetry. It's everywhere. Some poems, every single line ends with a dash, maybe has two in it. And that causes for us as the reader an opportunity to pause, to fill in the blanks, to be puzzled. The dash, it does a lot. More than half of Dickinson's poetry was written during the American Civil War. So that's from 1861 to 1865, though before and after there were still effects of this social and political upheaval. And as I said, none of her poems were published under her name in her lifetime. So I want to pause, and for folks on Zoom, I'll ask to answer these questions in the chat. But if you're just watching on YouTube, maybe you can leave a comment, jot down some thoughts on your own. Some of you are poets, some of you are reading poetry for fun. And for some of you, this might be the first time or the first time in a long time that you've sat down and read poetry. So take some time to reflect on your own strategies for reading a poem, and then put one or two strategies in the chat or in a YouTube comment if you want. What do you look for? How do you read? Do you read out loud? Do you read in your head? Do you read multiple times? And what do you do when you encounter challenging language or syntax? I'll share some of my strategies. So when I approach a poem, I try to read it out loud. Sometimes you're in a public space and it's hard to do that. So if I have to read in my head, I'll try to read really slowly, because so much of poetry is the relationship between sound and content and the themes and ideas that are being discussed in the poem. And so reading it out loud gives you an opportunity to hear how the poem works. What's the rhythm? What sounds are repeated? I also will look for any rhyme scheme. Maybe the last couple of words in a line have similar ending sounds and they rhyme. And when I encounter challenging language or syntax, I usually try to use context clues. As is the case with most poets, Dickinson really likes to rely on double meanings for words. So sometimes, if a word doesn't quite make sense where it is, I try to think about other definitions for that word. And if I'm really, really stuck, I'll look up a word in the dictionary. But I usually try to have that be a last resort because sometimes unfamiliar language can be a strategy that poets are using. So today we read before our class meeting, I'm nobody, I dwell in possibility, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. There is no frigate like a book, and in this short life, all of which talk about poetry, about the self, about the experience of reading. And so take some time if you haven't already to read these poems, think about how you might approach them, and then we'll meet again on the next video or the next class meeting to talk more about Dickinson's poetry.